Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about how to tell if a programmer knows what they're doing or if they're faking it. So let's get into it. So the question in question was pretty much that. Frederick, how do I know if a programmer actually knows what they're doing or if they're just faking it until they can solve the problem? And the short answer is you isolate them and then you give them a task where you know what the desired outcome should be. And then you see how it goes. That's how you do it. So let me explain that. The thing about being a software engineer and the idea that you can fake being a software engineer or fake the fact that you know how to write code is usually only true in two scenarios. One scenario is that you have the opportunity to work as part of a team because people are nice. And because people are nice, it's very likely that there are people out there who, if they were completely alone or had to do the work themselves without someone kind of covering for them or doing things like that, well, then they wouldn't be able to do the job. And that's very normal. There are many people around that have problems with software engineering and that constantly go for their coworkers for help, or even worse, they might not go to their coworkers for help, but they're pretty bad at what they do. So they solve things in a suboptimal way, but the coworkers are so nice people that they don't report it, or they kind of let things slide at the very least. So that's one thing that can happen. The other thing that can happen is that they can solve the problem, but they only solve it in a really bad way. And then usually what happens is that either the people who are consuming the code, or the managers or the product owners or the other stakeholders, they don't have the understanding of software engineering that is required to know what to do or to evaluate if this is good code or if it's bad code. To most people, software is just magic. It's just a spell that makes the computer do something magic. And if you don't know how magic works, you can't evaluate if this is a person who actually knows their stuff or if they're faking it. You can, of course, make a philosophical statement and state that, well, if the person can solve the problem, even if it's in an absolutely horrendous way with a lot of bugs and limitations, well, then they're not really faking it. They can still do it. And that is true, but if we're going with this analogy or this example, I'm pushing the idea of that this is not someone who just writes sort of bad code. I'm saying that this is a person that if I give them a list of 10 items and they should display that on a page, they hard code all those 10 items instead of using a loop. That's the sort of extreme I'm talking about here, just to kind of to make that clear, so that you don't go thinking that there is some magical benchmark for how well you need to write software until you're considered to actually do it and not fake it. Because if you write software and it actually does the thing it should be doing, even if it's not optimal, you're not faking it, you're actually doing it. You're doing it poorly, but you're at the very least doing it. But this is also a scenario where without an understanding of how software engineering works, you can't evaluate if the code is good or if it's bad. But in general terms, these are the two cases where you'll find software developers who don't actually know what they're doing. And the second scenario is actually not so horrible when you're just building something trivial, but it's really bad if you're a company who is hiring, say, a consultant or a freelancer or something like that, who needs to create a service for you or some application, and you have certain requirements on functionality, and they just completely botch the whole thing. They may get it out the door, and then you may not notice on the first two trivial tries that, oh, there are massive performance issues here, or there are massive security holes here, or something like that. There are so many companies who have suffered from making a bet on a programmer that was pretty much faking the fact that they knew how to build this. And I get I'm not saying nightmares, but I'm getting something very close to that when I hear people, usually on the internet, state things like stuff like, oh, just fake it until you make it, just pretend that you're a programmer and then just take on clients and so forth. And sure, you have to do this, I suppose, if you want to survive, but at the same time I get worried, because this is exactly the sort of attitude that leads to these sorts of problems. In my personal opinion, a programmer should never ever go at it alone unless they feel confident in the fact that the problem that they're going to solve is something that they can actually do. Because if they just do it, well, odds are that in a very similar way to a doctor who doesn't know what the fuck that person is doing, well, you might actually cause them real serious damage. People who have no idea of how to treat a certain illness should be grown up enough and take the responsibility of saying that, you know what, I don't actually know this. I shouldn't probably not be operating on this brain or this heart or something like that, because I might actually damage someone or kill someone. And software development is the same way. So the way that you know if this is going on is usually through isolation. And the other part is that you need someone that can evaluate the effectiveness of the person in isolation. Because if you isolate an individual and you just look, there is no way for them to justify the fact that the code that is produced isn't their code. They can't hide in the crowd or anything like that. It's not the team who delivered this, it's the person who has delivered this. This is a very common strategy that I've seen being used, and I've actually used at one point myself when dealing with a problematic coworker. If you put them on a specific project or isolate them in some fashion, you can very quickly tell if they can actually do the job, because they have no excuse. But the other part is that you need to be able to evaluate. And if you don't have anybody, or if you're a stakeholder with no technical knowledge, it's very hard for you to tell if they're actually faking their skills, or if they actually have them. An indicator that is very simple to go by, and that's something that even a non-technical person can understand, is if they can't deliver on time, or if things are constant, if there's a severe delay in what they're doing, if they don't progress. I'm not saying that delays is an indicator that someone's faking all the time, because it might be the case that the task was harder than expected, and then you have to account for that. But if we're talking a severe delay and it seems like they never ever get the job done, that's a very good indicator. And it's also why I tell people that don't focus on getting the code challenge or the code test to be the thing, and don't focus on that, because that's just the first piece of the puzzle. If you focus on that instead of focusing on acquiring real skills that will help you do the job, then you will be in the situation where you might fake it, get into the company, and you think that you might be naive and think that, oh, now everything's fine, right? No. You're going to get fired, because you will not be able to produce the results that are needed. And if you can't produce those results, I promise you, it's a hell of a lot worse to get fired and have that on your CV than it is to not get the job in the first place. So what I want you to take away from this is that usually the way that you evaluate if a programmer actually knows what they're doing as opposed to just faking it is, number one, you isolate them in some fashion. You create a situation where they have no excuse for what they're doing apart from their own work. And then you have to be able to tell if they are producing good code that is up to standards, or if they're producing bad code. If you can't tell what good code is, or what's really, really bad code at the very least, then you don't really have any other choice to go on. And then time. How long are they taking to produce something? If they never really make any progress, odds are that they are really, really bad at software development. Probably if they can produce even the slightest bit of code, they're most likely going around and spending most of their time just looking up Stack Overflow questions or something like that. Anything that can give them an indicator to how to just copy-paste the solution or something like that. And at the end of the day, they might actually produce something, but it's so subpar, or it's a workaround to the actual problem, because they simply don't know how to solve the problem in any other fashion. And lastly, I can also mention that if you're not actually hiring them, you're just talking to a person that talks about programming, it's usually a very easy thing to tell if they know the first thing about programming by asking them a few non-standard questions. Examples would be to ask people about things that they can't very easily Google for, or like very trivial, shallow things. A lot of people will talk about tools and what tools are cool and what tools are useful in the software industry. All you have to do is ask them a little bit of an in-depth question about the thing. And this goes for salespeople as well. And if someone tells you that, oh, we're using microservices, and you kind of go, oh, cool, what are some of the challenges that you've faced with microservices? They will quiet down immediately. Or maybe they're really read up on it. Well, it solves our problem with the scalability. And I go, oh, okay, how do you mean by that? Because usually microservices, they lead to a lot of process overhead. How have you mitigated the process overhead associated with microservices and model sharing, things like that? You very quickly figure out, like if you just go slightly deeper all the time, you will know how far their understanding of the problem actually goes. And they usually quiet down very quickly if they don't know what they're talking about. Have a great day.